We can hear it, Kristin.
Oh, thanks, Zach. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kristin Watson. I am one of the cardiology faculty here. I practice outpatient at the Baltimore VA. So I'll get Precepts. Some of you this year, I'm getting in trouble. Okay. It's not like I've taught here for a very long time and should know where to go. And so Sandeep and I, and I'm also the director of the Cards Residency Program, which is one of my favorite jobs. Okay, so Sandeep and I work closely together, and shout out to our former faculty member, Stormy Gale, who initially helped with the design. And I hope for all the residents in the room that you find, like I have with him and Zach, whose voice you come across, people who just go along with you and your love of different things, like my love of Marvel movies, and go ahead, and Bitmojis. We know I love Bitmojis, and let you run with the theme. So I brought some of my our things from the house. So I was informed by my 4-year-old when I get home today with Thor's hammer and the gauntlet that we're going to battle it out. So maybe I should get some practice while we're in here. So we are going to be talking about feedback, we do not pretend to be pros at feedback. It is very hard for both of us to give constructive feedback. So we are constantly learning how to do better with giving feedback. So we're going to go through some different things. There'll be some interactivity with raising your hand, and then we'll have a couple discussions, case discussions for you. There's something in the chat. Is that relevant? Oh, thank you, Moshe. She's one of our other faculty, and I send her Bitmojis all the time. I thought this worked. Oh, well, okay. All right. So we have no conflicts of interest. And so today our hope is that you'll be able to describe effective strategies for providing feedback, and then really working with your learners to find out what process works best for them, because it's not one size fits all for people. And then how do we do that feedback? If we have the chance, we'll talk about for the different trainees level performance. So the one thing I think is really helpful for, I'm just going to stay back here. So the one thing that is really helpful for us, even before we think about feedback, and we're not going to spend time talking about expectations, because that in itself is a whole other talk. But for those of you who are preceptors, I know when we first start having to put together our learning descriptions for our rotations, I was like, oh, this is tough. But now I really have learned to value the importance of doing that, because we have our expectations written out for our learners, so that they know what to expect and what we're going to expect of them from them when they are on rotation. And so just real briefly, I think it's really important for those of us who are preceptors and for you as residents to be asking about these different for preceptor roles. And the one thing that so we have our instructing, so that's me right now telling you different things. We have modeling. So when learners come to clinic with me, they have the they watch me in action, then they watch nurse practitioners in action to kind of form their own way to do it. And they kind of get expectations that way as we go through that process. And then coaching, facilitating, or moving a little bit above with going through patients with you, giving that feedback on performance as you go through, and kind of finally with facilitating, letting you run loose on your patient care service or whatever your practice may be, and being there to provide that feedback. And one thing I think that sometimes can get skipped for learners is the modeling approach. So that for the residents, we're going to have students as well. I think sometimes we have preconceived notions. Oh, this student's on their last rotation of the year, they must know how to interact with the medical team. So always putting that modeling perspective in, and we hear that from residents sometimes, that modeling will get skipped because they expect that the resident should have already learned this from pharmacy school or something else. And not only does it set that expectation, but also lets the learner learn that there are different styles and approaches. I can think of our critical care pharmacy team. They are all at the medical center. They are all phenomenal, but they all have kind of different approaches and how they interact with the medical team. So it's really good for the learners to see that. And then again, is setting what those expectations are for the rotation. to make it clear for them. So there's no surprises when that feedback comes. So we're going to kind of go through feedback, truths, and myths, because that is something things we have learned over the year. And it's always fun to have a theme, I guess, as we go through things. So by show of hands, is providing, how do I get this thing out of the way? So is providing any feedback better than providing no feedback? Okay. You also need a special person in your life like this gentleman who helps me when I do not understand tech. So is providing any feedback better than no feedback? Who thinks yes? Okay. Who thinks no? Yeah. So the answer is no. What? He's gonna have to click my side. So no, if you're not gonna be able to deliver that feedback in a correct, helpful manner, just keep your mouth shut, right? Or when maybe we're gonna send a email with feedback, right? A good rule of thumb that I learned from someone who used to be director of pharmacy here is when you're feeling like hot about something, wait 24 hours if you're putting it in writing so you can rewrite that. I'll do the same thing if I'm reviewing like written work for learners and I'm like, oh man, this is a mess. So then I kind of go back later and I will reread, if I'm writing comments, reread those to look at the tone in there. So to make sure they're really constructive, similar to what we talked about in that last session when faculty are getting feedback at the School of Medicine. So if we can't put in that constructive manner, it's better not to say anything at that time. You might be upset in the moment of something, right? It's good to act in the moment so there's good recall if an interaction happens. But if you feel that you're not gonna be able to give good feedback because you're on fire, right? You're so upset that we should step away, really be able to format what kind of feedback we are giving. So a couple quick tips that have been shown to be helpful for feedback and giving it is making sure it's timely. So acting in the moment, because if I say to Sandeep, we're just going to pick on him. Oh, I should pick on my residents. So Ami over there. So if Ami's in clinic with me and she keeps forgetting to ask about over-the-counter products, and then somebody discovers, I'm in heart failure, that a patient's taking an EdSed and she missed that, and that's what's causing the problem. That's a kind of oopsie daisy, right? So maybe that's in the first week of rotation. We don't discuss that. And then we get to that midpoint and I'm like, remember that time with the person you missed the NSAID? She wouldn't. But then she has to really think back at what was the problem at that point. So we want to give that feedback and why it matters as quickly as we can. We want to make sure we provide specific examples. So this is why you want to ask about over-the-counter use, because we know NSAIDs are bad, yada, yada. And stick to the facts. So really being careful when you're formulating that feedback, not to use you did this and well, your style is really sticking to what the facts. So I observed your body language really got tense when you were talking to the attending today. So giving that and how that can come, how that was perceived to you versus using these general phrases or like, you just seemed so disinterested today, right? So really being able to articulate what you mean. And it's got to be a two-way conversation. So the best thing that I have learned from colleagues of mine and have implemented is anytime I go in to give feedback, even as quick, like, hey, how did that patient talk about the patient interview? I always ask the learner first, what was their perception? I can tell you, I gave my fourth year who just finished with me feedback yesterday. And when he first gave me his thoughts on his own performance, I was like, oh yeah, that was like such an important thing that I really should have thought about. Like, yeah, this is definitely something that we need to work on, and how can we work on that together? Because sometimes they might have insight and also allows them that opportunity to do self-reflection, which is so important for us. So they can agree, disagree with them on things. Learners tend to beat themselves up, I think, with feedback, but like really working on those things together. And then they might disclose to you something they're really uncomfortable with, or they felt so nervous about, so that you can help better identify ways to work on them when you're going through feedback. And so remember, when we're thinking about feedback, feedback is like these one-time instances when we're talking to somebody. So having feedback Friday or after rounds, and you're talking about the interaction with the team versus doing our academic evaluations where there's rubrics to go through. And anytime we're giving feedback, we always want to make sure that we're telling them how they can improve in the process. So do people want to receive constructive feedback? Seen a lot of, yeah, they do, right? And sometimes people are going to get their back up against the wall, right? I know I do much better now getting feedback than I probably did when I first started here. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with if someone doesn't seem receptive to that feedback, it's how it's being given. So it's really good to watch body language, to watch facial expressions as you're giving feedback, because maybe you have to change your approach and how it is being delivered. You can even ask the learners how they like it to be delivered. So why may feedback not occur? So it's time consuming, right? We have so many things to do. Inpatient folks have to, they're doing checks on expiration dates in addition to their clinical roles, going to meetings, formulary review, whatnot. There's only so many hours in a day, so it cannot always be easy to fit that in. So a solution for that is put something that might help is you're in a longitudinal road, like they're with you for a week's, like full Monday through Friday. Put a specific time on your calendar that you're going to make sure you sit down and give some feedback. And like really have a checklist with yourself. Like my goal this week is 3 times on round or 3 times while we're staffing this week. I'm going to go ahead and give that feedback. So you can really make sure to carve out that time and set a reminder to yourself. Put something on like an alarm on your phone. It can definitely be uncomfortable. It can be very stressful to give feedback, especially when it's a concept you're not comfortable with talking about. So maybe it's how someone gets dressed. I know male colleagues of mine have had to give feedback on dress styles for women, and that it can be very hard and difficult for them to do. So how do we broach those subjects? We don't have training, right? Just like us as educators here, we just came here and are learning on the job here. Not very few pharmacy faculty have any educational training, right? So, and same thing with feedback. We don't work in our HR, we don't train in HR. So how do we eloquently and best do that as possible? So I personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues here, we're always trying to go to preceptor conferences because again, we don't have that training. So whenever we can take time to learn more about it is really helpful. You're always going to learn something from somebody and then borrow it. So is the feedback sandwich, my next question is the feedback sandwich the best approach to use when providing constructive feedback? Who says yes? Who says maybe? Okay. Who says no? Yeah, so we used to think the feedback sandwich was like, so great, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with the feedback sandwich, it's like your pieces of bread are your positive feedback. I should put peanut butter and jelly in here in the future because I'm vegetarian, so I would not be eating that. So the bread is give positive feedback, then you're going to give negative feedback. So that's our meat, cheese, lettuce, tomato. And then you come back into that positive feedback, right? So Sandeep, he was, oh my God, that was a really long time ago, but he was a student of mine, a resident under me. I precepted him a very long time ago. So you know what, you really interact, you really communicate well with the medical team. But when you're making those recommendations, you're not accounting for renal function. You're not looking at the drug interactions. However, I find that when you go into the patient rooms, you're really energetic, you communicate really well. What's he gonna hear? What's he gonna remember? All the good stuff, right? And so when you go from that positive, negative, positive, it really can help it's gonna let the learner feel, well, you're not comfortable in it. And it's kind of dishonest because you're just trying to, make things feel better by just giving that positive and not allowing time to really sit with that constructive feedback and give opportunities for improvement. So there is some evidence that using that feedback sandwich can decrease performance because it sounds ingenuine. It can sound manipulative, right? Or superficial. And then can dilute that constructive criticism. So you really want to stay away that approach. And I know many of those do that. And I know sometimes when I give constructive feedback, I like to go positive, give that constructive feedback. And then I have to hold out, really remind myself, no, don't go back to positive. Don't go back to positive. Because I just want to make somebody happy, right? Guarantee you he's the same way because he likes to make people happy as well. So it's really hard for many of us to avoid using that feedback sandwich because we're so worried about hurting people's feelings. But our goal is, right, to help improve performance. Mm-hmm. My God, you would think I don't work here. Okay, so how do we do this? So we don't want to make it personal. Again, citing specific feedback. We don't want to talk about too much at once, right? So picking those 1 to 2 interactions. And when you're stuck, write out a script with some bullet points. So maybe there's a sensitive topic that you want to talk about. So write out those bullet points. It also doesn't hurt to bring somebody into the room with you. We've done that with each other. When I first started here, we had a student who was really struggling. So I went in with my colleague and she was giving some feedback. So there was that extra documentation. Also, when in doubt, ask somebody above you or somebody who's really into this for their help. Because if you are not sure how to deliver constructive feedback, maybe it's something we're going to talk about some scenarios later, ask somebody who can really help you and don't give that feedback in the moment. Because if it's not good, it's not going to be effective at all, right? And then they're going, why are you coming back to this? You're being so, I don't know, nitpicky, probably like how I am as a wife sometimes, but it's okay. And then we want to be in use a relaxed environment. So it's real, we have desks in our offices, but many of us have tables and chairs. So it's really positioning yourself behind a table, like your desk is like a position of power. So it can be perceived as a position of power. So coming out from behind that, sitting at ABP, if you're here on our campus, to really give that feedback, or just standing in the unit side by side can be helpful as well. And so the other thing, always you can go to your RPD. You can go, when it comes to students, the experiential learning office at the school, at all the schools, colleges of pharmacy, can be a really helpful, especially when it comes to those professionalism things, which it's hard for us sometimes, right? I can give you feedback on how to do better about renal dosing and resources to use, but the professional stuff, professionalism things can be really hard as well, can be really tough for us. So an approach that can be helpful is using the ARCH method. So we talked about, you ask the learner to self-assess. You then reinforce correct thinking or actions, or maybe it's like my student yesterday, there was something I totally didn't think about when doing, when we were going over stuff. And I guess that was more eval based, but reinforce what their perception, what they are thinking. And also, again, if there's something you didn't think of, admit that, right? And then correct the errors. Again, how are they going to move forward with specific, what are tools that they can use to move forward to succeed? And then help develop that improvement plan. And sometimes you're going to find it's going to be necessary to put that in writing, especially if it's things you're going over again and again. We have found that it's really good to have that documentation. If you think it's a student who might not pass the rotation, that's even more helpful because when they would have to go to that experiential learning office and go through that failure, for residency program directors, preceptors, having that documentation written and then the learner verifying that they received it is a good thing to have. And somebody might be upset and forget everything you say, right? You just forgot half the stuff I said anyway, right? All right, so this is our lovely Alina from a few years ago. Our friends are so nice and play in our videos with us. So, but her name's Tony in this scenario. So she presents to a patient, to a physician, one of our pharmacist friends in there, and the physician explains a concept that will impact treatment. So this is something that happened with me in my practice, and a learner making faces and the body language to the attending was not okay. And I was like, oh, what am I going to do about this? So Tony appeared disinterested and annoyed by the physician's attempt to teach her. what are things that start running through your head when you hear this? Because I will say I had some unsavory thoughts initially in my head. What do you guys think?
That it could definitely affect the relationship between pharmacy and the medical team moving forward. So maybe just this one instance with one learner, but it could reflect poorly upon all pharmacy.
Yeah, right. How does it, what is that reflection? How can that reflect all pharmacy? And I've known this attending for a very long time, but it's like, oh my gosh, what do they think I changed? Like, what's going on there? See somebody commented in the chat.
Yes, I was supposed to say, I agree that it reflects poorly on you as a preceptor.
Mm-hmm. Why may that learner, what might have been going through that learner's head at that time, and why the body language and the eye rolling seem that way? Yeah.
I mean, it could have been miscommunication. So maybe they're thinking, or maybe they're like, that's their way of thinking and it just looks uninterested, or maybe they have a lot of other things going on in their life as well.
Yeah, so when I took some deep breaths, I waited till I was not going to act in the moment right after that patient interaction finished, because I was like, what? I waited, I calmed myself down, and then I said, how do you think that went when we were talking about patient X and you were getting that information from the physician and you were learning some new things? And here, the learner said they felt so uncomfortable because they felt like they needed to know that information and like were embarrassed, right? So my perception was, oh, they don't care what he's telling them. This is not relevant in their life, right? I kind of thought that worst case scenario. So by being able to have the learner self-assess and give their feedback first, it was incredibly helpful for me. But then the learner said, oh, you know what? I think I can see how that could have been perceived incorrectly. I didn't really have to do anything, right? So, and maybe it could have been the opposite. And maybe the learner really was disinterested. And so then I would give some examples why it's important to be respectful, yada, yada. Oh, I see some other comments in there.
Yeah, so someone was saying not listening, thinking about something else. Then the other one was like similar to what you said. Maybe she's overwhelmed. I would want her to understand how awesome an opportunity these interactions are.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, because the physician may have thought, well, why am I going to bother teaching her again if she clearly seems disinterested? And so that learner then really the next time, asked questions to show, and I'd have to say that, she was like, all right, and she asked questions to show that interest, because maybe that initial perception was that she was not interested in that situation, in the feedback that they were being given. Oh, forgot. Okay. And then one thing that can be really helpful in all of our settings is using this 360-degree approach. If you have not used that yet when you're giving feedback, so maybe you're focusing that day on, it's fine, that you're providing feedback on communication, right? Or that's like your goal. Maybe you set a theme for the week of something that you're going to work on, or something the learner asks to work on. It can be really helpful to get other people's perception of things as well, right? So I have learners come through at my clinic, learners, once they're ready to go, they present patients to attendings, cardiologists on their own. And so I get feedback from them. I ask the MAs, our medical assistants on the floor, about how their interactions were. And then and when I can, I always ask patients individually if they don't give feedback. Sometimes they'll stop me and give a lot of praise for the learner, but I find and the evidence has shown, and it is so helpful to get other people's perspectives, because maybe what's important to me as a pharmacist about an interaction, maybe a student is talking to the bedside nurse, and that bedside nurse really liked how the student did this, that, or the resident did this and that when they were communicating. Or maybe they have better ideas how to improve in the future. So I think it's getting that feedback from everybody who's involved. They don't have to give you written stuff. You can just pull them aside and tell them what you're specifically asking feedback on. where you're going to be addressing those 1 or 2 things that day, and then they can give you insight to use for your learner. And then when we sit down and we get to learn when we start that rotation with our learners, you can ask them if they have a specific way that feedback, what has worked for them in the past when they've gotten feedback. Some people who can come here for residency, nobody really ever gave them feedback, especially the folks who are in residency can really be rock stars, right? So we were just like, great, keep doing what you're doing. So then when it comes time to get constructive feedback, it can really be demoralizing to them. So asking how things worked for them before, what are the ways they like to get feedback, and that can be really helpful. You know, you'll have people like, one of our cards residents last year, he was like, do not sugarcoat things with me. Just tell me directly, like mark up my PT round, however much is marked up is okay, right? So they want to get that feedback, and they don't want, I'm not going to say things bluntly, but please don't feel like you have to hold back. Where somebody else may say, you know, I like just a little 1 chunk or twice out a day. I mean, don't make assumptions about people, right? So it's just all these people Loki's on here, and I don't know if any of the Marvel fans, I don't know how you feel about Loki, but I feel like he's generally good inside. So that's why he's come together with all the Avengers here. But don't make assumptions about what's going to work for the learner. And then the last thing with that feedback is make sure you're getting feedback on your own. So I often will say, how can I do better to help you reach these goals? Or are there anything else that I can do to kind of make this learning experience better for you? So making sure that feedback's a two-way street as well, because the learner's then going to feel much more engaged in that process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sandeep.
So I wanted to talk more about what she was talking about with like assumptions. I think a lot of people have experienced feedback for sure by now at this point, whether you're in pharmacy school or as a resident, this one here. And so the next part of this presentation is kind of want to help you to kind of rethink how you should approach feedback. So I don't know if any of you heard of the feedback fallacy. Anyone heard of it? Okay, it sounds like there's no. So yeah, this is a relatively new thing. I think it's a cool thing to really think about feedback. So the feedback policy was actually defined by like Marcus Buckingham. We humans do not do well when someone whose intentions are unclear tells us where we stand, how good we really are, and what we must do to fix ourselves. Mainly because they don't haven't established a trust with them yet. And then the other part of this was we excel only when people who know us and care about us tell us what they experience and what they feel. And in particular, when they see something within us that really works. As Kristin mentioned earlier on, giving any feedback is not always better than giving some feedback. You always want to be careful at how you're approaching giving the feedback. And it's really important to think about how that person that you're giving the feedback to will process that feedback. And we're going to kind of work through some of the theories that will help you kind of understand this a little bit better. But I'm not saying, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that you should never give feedback. That's not what this theory is talking about here for the fallacy. It's really just wanting you to be strategic about how you're doing it. Don't necessarily pick on someone who you haven't worked with, and just because they didn't do such a good job on their journal club in front of a room here, but you don't know them very well. You shouldn't be giving that feedback publicly in front of a group of peers, so on. So you want to be careful on like how you're giving the feedback. Why aren't we good at feedback? There's several actual theories for why there is. We're not good at it. There's 3 different theories that we're going to be delving into a little bit more, and we'll go into these specifically. So the first one is the theory of the source of truth. So this is talking about like you're making the assumption that giving feedback is going to be helpful to your learner, whether it's a resident or a student that you're precepting. And you think that you're doing them a favor by giving them that feedback. And this is your source of truth. But honestly, they may not know you very well or trust you and what your intentions are. We are actually notoriously bad at evaluating others. Why is that? It's because we don't realize that what we're giving may actually, what the impact might be on it. It may put them on the defensive, or if they feel like it's an attack. Ratings often actually reflect our own characteristics, not the characteristics of the learner. So here's a very common, the most common example I can think of right now is that this actually happened during my practice. So we were having, you know how pharmacotherapy routes, it's a bit of like a continuing education program, and we have to have our learners prepare for it. And so we used to do a practice session for it. In the past, I've been in a situation where we had several preceptors who were in the room along with the resident and thinking that, oh, okay, great, we're getting so much feedback for the resident, make sure that they're really prepared for their pharmacotherapy round when they actually do their pharmacotherapy rounds. But the problem was they were giving conflicting feedback, and the mentor may not always, I'm seeing some yeses, some people have been in this situation, it sounds like. Yeah, so the problem is, and sometimes the mentor doesn't even agree with some of the feedback that's being given with from the preceptors, right? That's not a great situation. If you can recognize that as a preceptor, which is what I was, how can you imagine what the residents feel like right now at this point? They're like conflicted. They don't want to argue against the stuff on a preceptor if you don't agree with it, but they also don't want to go against them and they don't want to incorporate it if they don't agree with it, right? So how do you handle that situation? So it's kind of going back to this again. The preceptors feel so strongly about their feedback, but that's their own truth, right? It's a different truth for everyone. You shouldn't assume that your truth is the right answer. So that's going back to the your truth thing. So I just want you to be careful when you're wording your feedback. You should not make it personal, like to the resident, like attack them, like so you should do this, for example. More like you're trying to provide your reflections and help them as a guide is what you're supposed to be thinking about. So think about that, because could you imagine if you're a resident in that situation, getting multiple feedback that's conflicting, like how are you supposed to handle that? That's very overwhelming for the resident. So just kind of explain what I mean by the personal reaction. You can say nice job on your patient presentation to the learner, but really that's not a great way to kind of phrase that. First of all, it's very vague. It doesn't really give you much information of what did they do like well with the patient presentation. But the key thing is here, you're focusing on them rather than what your reactions are to it. What I would think it would be better is, here are 3 things that were very clear to me that you did well. And so I can list then what those things that I thought you did very well. And that's something that I observed doing that. So I'm making it very clear, this is what my truth is. You probably have heard this. You need to improve your patient's communication skills. It's gonna probably make you feel a little bit more on the defensive here when you say that, when you hear the word you need to do this. And if you don't really trust that person, especially like in a group of like your preceptor or someone, it might not be the best feeling. So rather than saying it like that, you should say, here's where the patient seemed a little lost, and this is what I observed. So that way it doesn't seem like you're attacking the learner. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's move on to the second theory, which is the theory of learning. So the theory of learning assumes that, okay, you're a student or a learner, you obviously don't know much. So I'm gonna be here to give you the feedback and tell you everything that I know. That's not probably the best way to be going about it, right? Because that they're probably not gonna take that very well if you make it seem like they're dumb or something like that too. There's actually a good study to show that the learner will respond in different ways depending on whether it's negative feedback or it's positive feedback. If it's negative feedback, what happens is it actually can hinder their learning because they kind of almost shut down, and it actually their brain doesn't function as well as it's supposed to. They don't actually take in new information because they're fixated on that. If you remember, like I know this happened to me, like when you're getting your evaluation of teaching, and all these great comments you're getting, but then you get like 1 or 2 bad comments, and then I'm like, I only fixate on those two comments. And that I feel like that's really the actual theme for the whole thing. And so that's kind of the same thing. I don't even think about like, what did I do well anymore? But I'm only fixated on the negative stuff. So that's kind of what happens when you're doing that in real life. So giving negative feedback is actually not good for trying to enhance the learning experience. Whereas positive feedback actually has been shown to enhance the learning. And these learners actually will then go ahead and learn more new information. They're able to assimilate more information and do better. So it's actually better to try to focus more on the positive feedback and not the negative. Of course, if you want to give constructive feedback, try to do it positively though, rather than doing it negatively. So how can we do this better by knowing that theory? Never lose sight of your highest priority interrupt. So a common example that I provide is like having a resident who's running a code, and you see that they've done so many things right. They did the checklist they're supposed to be doing. They were drawing up the medication, and then they were making sure that they were clear on when they're supposed to give the epinephrine, right? So most people usually would just be like, okay, good job. And then that's it, they move on. No, this is actually your highest priority interrupt. You should stop right then after the code's done before moving on to the rest of your day and actually tell your resident or your student, what did you do very well? This is what you did very well on your thing. What I observed here is you did an amazing job of drawing up the medications, and you did a great job of communicating with the team and so on, right? So that by doing that, your learner knows what that level of success should be, defining what success is for them. That's important to them. They don't know that. No one tells them what you need to do to be able to be successful. So it's important to go over that with them and help them understand what that level of success is by telling them what did they do very well. And that way they know, okay, I should continue doing those behaviors in the future. And this is the other thing that I may have not done so well, and I should improve on that for the future. Does that make sense? Okay. So the last theory that I'm going to just touch upon is called a theory of excellence. So assuming that the opposite of if you don't achieve excellence, that means you failed. That's actually not true. It's not the opposite of it, because there are different definitions of excellence. Of course, there are certain things that we have very specific criteria for, like the code example that I have. Of course, there's going to be a very specific way that you should be doing it because we've done it and we know that you have very little time. But what I'm referring to is like maybe getting ready, pre-rounding for patient care. There's so many different ways. I know Chris and I definitely think differently when it comes to reviewing patients before we do it, especially we're in different clinics anyway with this one. So what is her definition of success versus mine is probably going to be different. We have different benchmark criteria while you're doing it. Same thing with the learners. You learners as in general will have different priorities in life. You may not be as interested in certain things as opposed to the next resident. It's really not a good idea to be comparing yourself to the other resident, and for that reason. And so you have to define what the learner's personal success story, what their level of definition of success. And that's why it's crucial at the beginning of the rotation to ask them what their goals are. That's what you're trying to achieve, not my goals. So the rotation is not about me as the preceptor, right? It's about them as the learner. You want to help them achieve their goal. That's the success that they should be going to. So just because I had these goals for myself and the learner didn't do that, like for example, publishing a book chapter, that doesn't mean anything to them. They don't have that goal for themselves. So why should they be judged by that, right? So that's why I just want you to be careful in saying that just because you didn't achieve this because the other person did, does not mean you're a failure. You should be figuring out what your own goals are and then achieve those goals, whether it's through the rotation or in your job. So how can we do better? It's important to really specify what those outcomes are for each of the learners. This is, again, going back to like at the beginning of the rotation or the learning experience, ask them, what do you think your goals are? What is it that you want to achieve during this time period? So use their outcomes, not your own outcomes, and what you think is that, because that's going to lead to a lot of disconnect. And that's why you probably have had a rotation where your preceptor felt like had such high standards and you didn't feel like you were ever going to meet those standards.
Again, going back to what I said about that from the first theory of source, please use your own personal reactions rather than attacking your learner, saying, oh, you need to do this. But it's fine. Think about it as more like, this is what you observed, and I want to help you by telling you these information of what I observed. And then the other thing is about considering your experiences as you think about like how you can help them for the future. It's important to consider your present experience, what that level of success is, what have you done well in the past, and then what can you use, carry forward to the future. You know, like everyone probably has, at least I know I was taught in school, like I need to think about like how the ways I can improve and so on. I never think about like, what am I doing well? And what can I do to build upon the success that I've had? So I want you to kind of reframe your thinking a little bit, and don't forget to think about that you don't also think about like your, the successes that you've had and how you can build on those successes. So just to quickly finish up with this section here, which of the following statement is consistent with the Buckingham's theory of learning, specifically the theory of learning? I'll give you a minute to do it. You can certainly use the chat function for those who are in there. How many people think it's A? B? C? D? Okay, and it looks like in the chat, there was people saying D. I can see why you can think about the D as the right answer. Remember, we were talking about the theory of learning, specifically the theory of learning, but that's why. So D would be incorrect if I was talking about the source of truth. That's the theory of source of truth, we're referring to the rater's characteristics rather than the trainee. So I kind of was tricky there, I know. For the C, that is the correct answer. Well, focusing on their positive feedback will actually enhance their learning by way better than the negative feedback. So remember that when you're thinking about constructive feedback. Negative feedback will actually decrease learning. And then the first one's wrong is because there's definitely a difference between the two. Okay. Just a little dad joke here. Like, I hate you. Make you feel fixing the universe is hard potatoes. No, actually it's not, but here. So the last part of this presentation that I was going to just go through is what about those, we always talk about, you may have been to a presentation where how do you deal with a difficult or unmotivated learner or someone who is is not being challenging during rotation, but we never really talk about what about those who are doing exceptionally well. I mean, a lot of times people just say, oh, you're doing a great job. I don't really have any feedback for you. Probably not the best thing you should be doing for your learners. So I kind of wanted to talk about this a little bit. But we'll start with this first. Which of the following statements best describes one strategy to provide feedback for the exceptional learner? So I'll give you a minute to read those. Feel free to put in the chat function too, if you have any answers. Okay. Okay, thank you. That's great. How many people think it's A? B? C? Okay, pretty much the majority here. Anyone say D? Yeah, we're gonna get into this in a minute, but honestly, assuming that the learner is doing well, knows that they're doing well, it's not a good idea. I personally have never felt like I was the strongest student. I never felt like I was ready for residency, honestly. So I definitely had a very problem with self-esteem, honestly, back in my 4th year and even my PGY 1 year, honestly. So I was always completely hard on myself, and she's already shaking her head. She knows this very well. But yeah, so I was very hard on myself and everything. So yeah, I never thought I was doing anything well, honestly, during the time. And I've kept thinking, how can I do this better? And this is why I really like the feedback fallacy, because it really applies to me directly, because I was making a lot of the same mistakes that the feedback fallacy was talking about. So I honestly needed that feedback that you actually are doing pretty well. You know that, right? So it was good. No feedback is needed if the learner is performing the same thing, kind of a similar situation here. Future goals, absolutely. You should definitely be in the focus, like helping them to get to beyond even where they are. You should always take them to the next level for sure. You should push them and make it challenging for them. And then only highlight their remarkable attributes is not going to get them very far. Yes, it's great that you're going to, I do want you to highlight them, but you should do more than that. That's not going to help them to improve. Okay. How does this feedback just differs? Preceptors may feel like they're being nitpicky, which is a problem because you feel like that's why we should say, okay, you're doing a great job because you hit all the rotation goals and everything. So everything you kind of feel like it, you're being nitpicky. So you have to be very careful how you word things because it's interesting. I've been with two different types of exceptional residents or students, and they can kind of react in different ways. One, they can be taken aback because they've never been given feedback before, and they're like a little bit shocked that you're telling them constructive feedback. So you have to be careful with how you're handling the feedback with them. And the other one is they're so desperate for feedback because they keep thinking they need to improve. So I've seen both extremes with this one. So it's very interesting, and you have to be careful how you word your feedback. And then, of course, like I said, learner may not be used to receiving criticism because most of the rotation, they probably are saying, oh, you're doing well. I don't really have much to give you, like with this one, which is not the best way to handle it. Here. And that's why they have that kind of mentality whenever they do get feedback. And that's why it's important that you don't enforce that. Just because they're doing well performance-wise, you have to think about what's going under the surface. That's the key thing here. There's a lot of things that might be happening under the surface that you have to be careful with. What about the process of why they're doing so well? So here's a common example. We talked about the pre-rounding experience. Okay, so they did a great job. They know all the patients, right, and everything. So that's great and all this stuff. But how long are they actually taking to get to know all those patients? Do they get up at 4 a.m. to go and look at the patients? Probably not a good situation, right? As opposed to someone who did it in just an hour and was ready for round on all those patients. So here it's going back to the work-life balance. What are those opportunities cost to happen in order for them to get that achieve optimal performance? You have to, that's what you should be focusing on when you're thinking about feedback for exceptional learners, because there's usually some sort of opportunity cost to happen. They're working too much on the weekends. They're not giving themselves time for self-care or whatever it is. That's what's going to be the problem. And it's your job as a preceptor to kind of investigate to make sure maybe there isn't a problem, but you should make sure of that. Okay, because usually the residents are not going to tell you that, or the student. So there's 3 tiers to kind of think about here. You want to think about the current performance. Going back to what I was talking about with the highest priority interrupt, you should make sure that you tell them what they're doing well and why they're doing well very clearly. Talk about the current performance. And then this is where I always do this with the PGY1s or the PGY2s, if they're doing exceptionally well, is start thinking about how can I make them to the next level, whereas how can I get them to the PGY2 level for a PGY1 resident or to the clinical specialist level as a PGY2, because they've already now achieved everything that I was happy with for the rotation. That's what I usually end up doing. So for the PGY1, I'm like, all right, you've got what I need you to do. So let's try and see if we can get you another goal. So the goal I would have is like, have you tried following more of these patients on the service and learning how to be more efficient with that? But the PGY2, I usually push them to try to be have you started to have relationship with the consult service, like the infectious diseases or something like that? Or have you had a chance to, so yes, you're following the whole team, but are you taking several hours to follow that whole team? Have you figured out a way to be more efficient with your time and doing it? Because you're going to need to do that in your clinical specialist role. So that's how I kind of learned to push them in the way that I think that they can definitely achieve, so that would be even better when they become a clinical specialist. And then at the end of the rotation, I definitely want to discuss with them what those future goals should look like. Okay. So just to summarize, for the exceptional learner, you definitely want to give both positive and constructive feedback. You don't want to just assume that everything's good. Identify the areas for development, like I said, try to push them to the next level and focus on the future or the goals. What you shouldn't do is assume they know where they stand, that they may be, they honestly don't know. let them be. That's the worst you could do, just kind of let them ride it out here. And then presume that potential has peaked, that no one has peaked at all, especially during training. I don't even feel like I've peaked yet. I hope not for this one. I hope there's still something left for me for this one here. So, okay, we're gonna end off with like a couple of scenarios. We may not be able to get to the second scenario, but we'll at least have it there for you to kind of think about here. So let's talk about the first one, feedback for the high performer. Thor seems to be doing everything right. He's prepared for rounds, discussions, answers most questions without assistance. The team seeks out his opinion. You know that you should not tell Thor to keep on doing what he is doing during the weekly feedback sessions. So what do you do? What steps can you take to make sure that he's getting feedback here? Go ahead.
So I guess the first thing you want to do is maybe make sure you describe to him exactly what he's doing well, and then kind of set those kind of higher expectation, or like, just on the frontier that he can start thinking about.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it's good to like kind of help him understand where he can go from here. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's important. Go ahead, Sarah.
I think one way you can take it the next step, kind of back to the examples you gave earlier in the presentation, was now asking questions about like sustainability. Like, you've now checked the box of your performance is excellent, and that's great, and I want you to keep that up, but at the same time, I want to make sure that the process is sustainable now moving forward. Is this going to be a long-term solution to maintain that type of performance? So really diving into those types of questions with the learner, because I don't think we get the opportunity to do that quite as much with learners because we're so focused on performance. So I think that would be a good next step.
I remember when I was a resident, that was back when we used paper for everything. But when my preceptors sat with me and watched my process, like I was prepared for rounds and they sat with me and looked at stuff that I wrote down or was like typing, you guys type stuff and like really kind of gave feedback, like you said, to go to the next step. So like, okay, stop writing all these labs down. Which ones do you really need for each patient? Which data do you really need to be writing down? And so that allowed me to become more efficient, but having them watch me do what I did was really helpful because then they could give me very specific feedback on how to improve.
Thank you, Sarah and Krista. Those are awesome. That was great ideas. I think it's great for everyone else to hear that too. As well. Oh, yeah. And then Marshall was saying, ask if there is something he wants to work on. Absolutely. Like I said, again, even I said that at the beginning of the rotation, but you should also do that anytime you're doing feedback sessions with them. If you don't have much left, you should be asking them, what do you think you would do? Because honestly, a lot of these people do tend to know how to self-reflect and they know what they want to work on. Again, they have their own personal idea of what their success should be. And you should not be comparing it to other people, right? So that's why I think it's great to ask that. So I completely agree that you should think about that too as well. Great comments, everyone. Since we're already short on time, I'm just gonna put this up here for you guys to think about here. That's why this is another faculty member of ours. Well, this one here, Zach. But so it's caught red-handed. A member of your interprofessional team notices your learner, RJ, taking and eating food that does not belong to him. The person reporting this knows that lunch belongs to one of the nurses. Unfortunately, this actually happened with one of our students on rotation and everything here. So I'm not gonna, I'll leave this here for you guys to think about this with us right now because we're running out of time. I just want to make sure, are there any questions that people had? Go ahead.
I appreciate that you mentioned when you ask students or residents to set their goals that they might not be the same as your goals, but what do you do if their goals conflict with what they say they want? So let's say they say they're a student and they want to do residency, but they only want to work up 2 to 3 patients out of 18 on their service.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so sometimes I'll have 100%, so I'm like, no. But so like tactfully say, if you want to do residency, we have to build that as time goes on. And here's how we're going to work together to build that up. I'll have people who come to clinic with me sometimes and I have them set goals. And so they'll set goals like, I want to become very proficient in selecting anticoagulation for different indications. And so I have to say, that's great. And if it will come up, we'll talk about that on individual basis, but we're not going to consistently see that. So is there another thing, thinking about drugs for heart failure? So especially if there's not that possibility, but when they are shooting low, try to help them identify how to set goals to kind of improve as time goes on during the rotation.
So you talked a little bit about kind of the high performers, a slightly different category almost. How do you kind of deal with the overachievers? I think AJHP had a good article on this a couple of months ago where, high achievers have that realistic expectations, whereas overachievers are also kind of driven, but end up sacrificing mental and physical health to end up attaining what they need to at the very end, where that's the population where you almost want to slow them down a little bit so they don't end up running into a wall. So how do you kind of handle that?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's sorry. I think that's a great question, honestly, because it can be challenging, especially if you have two at the same time on rotation with you. It's definitely happened to me with this one. And honestly, I don't think there's one right answer on how you do it with this one. I think the key thing that I have to remember is I'm trying to make this rotation useful for both of the learners in one way or the other. And unfortunately, the best way I could do it was trying to individualize it for both of them. And they're both clearly in different stages of their careers or what their learning is. And also they may have they're clearly going to have different goals here with this one. And so what I'm teaching one person may not be relevant for the other person. So this is where it's key that you have individual time with both of them for different reasons. Definitely you can have group time. And I think you can accomplish a lot in the group setting, but I also think it's important that you also give time, dedicated time for each learner. Yeah.
I've been known to be an overachiever, as are certain other people that are in this room and online. So I will share like feedback that I've gotten with folks. So I find it's really helpful, like when you've done something where you can do better, I've gotten feedback to share that on my own and talk about the risk of like, if you keep up this pace, you're going to fizzle out, right? And then if you're in patient care, the worst thing could possibly happen and harm could happen to a patient when we get there. So teaching them how to say no, teaching them, I love to share how I've messed up in life because of that, trying to be an overachiever sometimes. And I think sometimes it has to do with the self-confidence issue. Like he has this opportunity, I don't have that. Oh my gosh, right? So really just having a heart-to-heart discussion with somebody about that and not being, because one of the things we see at the school, not only from these type of situations, if you have somebody who's an achiever, you're a student who's performing really poorly, is that no one wants to speak up and do anything about it. So then they get to last rotation, they get a preceptor who's going to fail them. And the learner's like, nobody ever said this before. So it's because we get being vested in that learner and being comfortable enough to broach that subject. They may not want to hear it. So I would also take the approach of, just like we kind of do with talking to patients and some things is, I've observed these things. I would love to talk to you about this a little bit more. Would that be okay? Because they just may be like, what are you talking about? Right. But at least you're putting the idea in their head and then they can start to reflect on that.
Go ahead.
So from a learner's perspective, what I've encountered a fair amount of times is that, when I'll ask for feedback, it's first asked of me to self-reflect. What do I think I can improve on? And very often, the response I've gotten is, yes, that good. And so, do you have any tips for us as learners to try and dissect a little further other than just to sort of get, a reflection of what we've just said kind of just regurgitated back to us, or how we as preceptors can avoid sort of that reflex of saying, yes, that's what I was going to say, and sort of take the easy route to avoid giving feedback?
Yeah, I can see how that could be tricky because you're trying, you think it's a great job, but like right then it's just happening. And you're trying to also move on with the other things with this one. But honestly, I don't think it's a problem to actually bring up the feedback as you can with this one, to be honest. Like I tend to do that because I joke about like, I also don't think I'm gonna remember by the end of the day to tell you, like to give you this feedback and everything. So if I think that there's something really well that's going on and everything, I usually will tell the learner whenever we get a break. Either it could be like during their presentation or whatever, or during rounds even, because there's always downtime around if you're like with the learner at that point. You honestly, it's good. You can use your judgment, like when you think you can give that feedback. It doesn't have to be like literally right that minute, but try to at least tell them sometime during that day or something like that before you forget about it or something, or at least make a note for yourself to make sure that you do give that feedback.
Or rather, like, how do you navigate when your preceptor's feedback of you is just like
Yeah.
saying that your self-assessment is accurate, end of story?
So I think one thing that you can do is just say, do you mind giving me one or two specifics? Because I want to make sure I have the same, like I'm on the same lines with you. Are there other things that you thought about? Or if they're like, okay, you got it now on, like, can you give me, I'm trying to take myself to the next level here, continue trying to improve. Can you give me one or two steps how I can move forward? Because if they say to you, okay, the next time you encounter this situation, you could do blah, blah, blah. That's feedback, right? Because they're saying, when you're talking about a patient with something serious, is, making sure you're opening position so you're not, seem like you're closed off. So if they give you those specific steps of like, how do you move forward or grow, that's feedback in itself as well. But I think if you don't ask for that and tell them that you're looking for more, they may not give it to you. Absolutely. So yeah, the onus is going to be on you in that situation.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were talking for the other angle, so thank you for clarifying that with this one here. But yes, I completely agree. I think you just have to, like during your feedback session, bring this up with this one. I don't think it's a problem to bring up. It shouldn't be an awkward, I hope not, if you've established your relationship with your preceptor and you're like thinking about, thank you so much for the feedback that you've given me. And now I really would like to try to push myself and get ready for like I'm going to be a critical care pharmacist in the next couple of months. What can I do to make sure that I'm ready to be I'm a critical care clinical specialist? So that's kind of how I approach it. So I like the way Kristin had mentioned, like 1 or 2 stuff that I can do. Just kind of keep that in mind and frame it that way so that they understand. You're talking about like in preparation for your career or whatever. Great question. All right, unfortunately, we're out of time. We'll be around. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us if we do this. But I want to move on to the next presentation. Thank you all. Appreciate your time.